switch on, meaning you are not online, you are not noticeable.
I think we have
Couple more minutes, right?
Yeah. You wanna?
Well, one more minute.
Right, one more minute. You wanna do the presentation? I mean, and do the question after all the presentations?
No, I think because each paper is
Different.
very different. I think we'll take
Right.
questions immediately after each presentation, very briefly, and then we'll.
Okay, so we have around 20 minutes for the
15 minutes.
15 and a 15-minute
paper.
presentation. And 15 minutes question.
No, 15 minutes per presentation and about 5 minutes maximum for discussion after each presentation.
Okay. Then we will have 30 minutes extra in the end. Right?
Yeah.
That will be a big discussion.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, so you'll do the minutes then?
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
perfect, thanks.
Yeah, finished. Thank you.
It starts. Okay, why don't we start? It's the end of the conference. This is the last time slot, so I'm actually quite pleased to see there are people here. I think we were all prepared to just be talking amongst ourselves. So welcome with huge enthusiastic open arms. My name is Sol Iglesias. I am a PhD candidate in the Southeast Asian Studies Department at the National University of Singapore. I'm from the Philippines, although I've lived in Singapore for a long time. Prior to my current return to graduate school, I was with the Asia Europe Foundation for many years. So I'm very pleased to be here. Oh, I actually wanted to show off a little bit of my Indonesian skills, which is also more or less Bahasa Melayu, so I wanted to say Selamat Siang. But also, Siang, right?
Yeah,
Sama-sama. But also magandang hapon. Just to say that we're very pleased to be here, part of this panel, which I would say sort of encapsulates the importance of micropolitics as a part of understanding large macro national political issues. So this panel is, the title says that it has something to do with government vis-a-vis the citizen. In my sort of political sciencey way, I would say state-society relations. And we can situate this collection of research presentations in this sort of broader question. All right? So even though I expect that each presentation will demonstrate how state as such and society as such can be conceptualized in so many different ways. I don't think we'll be following the same framework at all in this afternoon. And what we will do, however, is we'll be looking at different political processes. We're looking at democratization, particularly democratization after a transition from authoritarian rule in the Indonesian and Philippine cases. And we're looking at processes of decentralization, and as well as processes of nation building, which apparently never ends, even after half a century. So, and all of these processes fundamentally influence state-society relations, whether it's state against society, or society against the state, or society within state. These different kinds of configurations that we will see in these cases from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Ms. Melissa Bintoro, who is a PhD student at the Department of Politics and International Studies, the University of Cambridge. Her research looks at local elections and incumbency at sub-provincial levels in Indonesia. So, Melissa?
Thank you. Should I just pop there?
Yeah, it's open
I
here.
see.
Is there a light thing? Is it behind? Can we turn out
The panel behind you, just on the wall behind you?
Right here?
Oh.
I
No.
Check Sabi.
Okay, is that better?
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Alright. So Hi everybody. As I mentioned, my name is Melissa. It's nice to see some awake faces in the last panel of the conference. Today I'll be talking a little bit about the incumbency advantage in Indonesia's latest local elections in 2015, or Pilkada Serentak. So why is this important? After decentralization, the local governments play such a major role in shaping citizen welfare. So according to the Ministry of Finance in 2016, local government expenditures totals to close to 35% of the national expenditures. So it raises the question of how do these people get elected in the first place? If you follow local elections in Indonesia, you probably have heard of all the problems that have happened in the Pilkada. You have money politics, tensions between different ethnic and religious groups, etc., etc. And at some point, in 2014, the local parliament actually tried to they did pass a law that cancelled local elections and tried to replace it with indirectly elected leaders. But fortunately, that was repealed by the president. But even with all the irregularities in local elections, I'm really interested in, does that lead to systematic advantages and disadvantages among candidates? So incumbents typically have an advantage over challengers due to the resources that accrue from holding office. So a lot of the literature actually comes from American politics, and these are some of the reasons why they might have an advantage. The first is franking privileges. So I guess in an Indonesian case, I've heard anecdotes about how, for example, like health cards or something, they might have a picture of the incumbent or something like that. So it's one way to promote kind of the incumbent name. Constituency service, I guess that's more for legislators, but also they can use state resources to, go open a school. Like if a school is opening, then they can open the school, and etc., etc. Media coverage. Incumbents usually play a bigger role in the media, or are more covered in the media. There were some anecdotal evidence of kind of incumbents wishing people like happy Eid Mubarak during Eid, which if you're a challenger, you don't really have that opportunity to represent the government in doing so. Staff support, there's a lot of issues about incumbents mobilizing the bureaucracy during local elections. Campaign finance, they can manipulate social spending, discretionary spending, etc., etc. And name recognition, incumbents generally are more well known than the challengers in general. So the research question that I'm trying to answer is, if the perquisites of office is considered a de facto campaign subsidy, as has been pointed out in the literature, what is the value of holding office during the electoral process? So in this research, I tried to measure that. So a little bit of background on local elections. So prior to 2001, Suharto appointed local leaders, so the provincial governors and the district mayors were allowed to finish their 5-year term, which means that you have staggered different mayors and governors finishing at different periods of time. And with the advent of indirect election, they were it's a two-step process. The first is that the people would directly elect their legislators, and then these legislators would kind of select the mayors or the governors that should be in place. And that caused a lot of problems, particularly with buying off the legislators, to put it bluntly, which led to a transition into direct elections under Law Number 32, 2004. And as I was mentioning, and this is quite important to my identification strategy, these elections are staggered, so they occur at different points in time. It was only until 2015, with the new Pilkada law, that they tried to make it a simultaneous elections, which took place on 9 December 2015. So these simultaneous elections will take place in several waves, accumulating in the national simultaneous elections, which will occur sometimes in 2027. So for this research, I will focus on the first wave, which is the 9 December 2015. So these are for governors and mayors whose end of term was between 2015 and mid-2016. And if you notice that if the elections is happening in December, some of these incumbents have finished their term. And so for this round of elections, it includes 9 provinces and 260 districts spread across Indonesia. As I was saying, since incumbents in different districts finish their term at different periods, some of them are no longer in office. So when they're finished in, for example, like June of 2015, they're replaced by a career bureaucrat who is selected by the governor. And in this graph, so the x-axis represents the number of months to elections. So for example, like 5 months to elections or 6 months to elections mean that it's in June, 5 months is in July, etc. And if the negative numbers represent the districts in which the mayors or governors finish in 2016. So they are always in office during this election period. And the end of term can be considered as if random, since it kind of follows from when the Suharto era mayors sort of finish their periods. And this is important because it means that these mayors cannot self-select in when their term ends. For example, if it is the case that more stronger mayors are able to choose and then they choose to like get out of office in December, then it means that they're in office during that time. And if you see differences between the different mayors, it's attributed to some quality of the mayor that we can't capture. In the media, there is an increasing, I guess, presence of the preeminent role of incumbents, particularly with the presence of single candidate pairs. So this is a nice little diagram done by Kompas on 6 different districts in which they extended the registration period for candidates several times because no one was running against these incumbents. But in the end, there was only 3 districts that ended up having single candidate pairs, which is Blitar, Tasikmalaya, and Timur Tengah Utara. And since these candidates were really strong, there was also the concern that since at some point they weren't allowed to have single candidate pairs, and hence prior to the law being passed, there was an issue of calon boneka, which is puppet candidates, that some of these incumbents are kind of proposing to run against them so that they will be able to run in the 2015 elections. So that basically shows that some candidates are just really powerful in some of these districts. But looking at the data, you have 260 districts, which is about more than half of the districts in Indonesia that went through the 2015, the first wave elections. 61% of incumbent mayors ran for a second term, and only 65% of them were re-elected. And you can see that it's geographically kind of spread around. It's not like concentrated in specific islands or necessarily. And why do some of the incumbents not rerun? It could be possible that they hit their 2-term limit, so they're not allowed to rerun. Some of them might not get party endorsements, or they didn't have money to run as an individual candidate. They might choose not to run. So there's just different reasons why they do not run. But a majority of them are because they're term-limited candidates.
Do you know how many?
I don't have that in my head, but I can probably let you know about it. So here it shows that we see that 30-something% of incumbents do not always win, but when we compare the winners, the vote share of the winners, if they're an incumbent, they tend to get a greater number of vote share compared to non-incumbent winners, and it's considered statistically significant. I think the numbers was about 54% for incumbent winners and about 46 or 48% for non-incumbent winners. Why that might be the case might be just 2 different equilibrium, I guess. Perhaps you might have really strong incumbents and not very strong incumbents. But most importantly, elections in districts with and without an incumbent mayor running are equally competitive. So you can see on the left side, the number of candidates that are running, whether or not you have an incumbent, is almost the same. It's a little bit less for when there's an incumbent, but it's not statistically significant. And in the literature, there's a concern about challenger scare-off. For example, like if the candidate is running, maybe you don't get as high quality candidate, or you don't get candidates running against them because they don't really want to go against the incumbent. And on the right side, you also see that the turnout rate is about equivalent for when there is an incumbent and when there's not an incumbent running. This is something interesting that I found, and I'm not quite sure why, but the incumbency advantage is not homogeneous, and re-election rates are really much higher in Java and Bali, even though on the left side you see that the percent of incumbents running are about the same. They're not statistically significant for those people or those in Java and Bali. But when you see on the right side, it's the percent of incumbents who's re-elected is like 85%, as opposed to 58% in the rest of the country. I'm not quite sure why. I talked to the Electoral Commission about it, and they gave me a bit of a cultural answer, I guess. Like, Japanese people are happier with status quo. I don't really know, and I don't know how to test that empirically. But I just thought this was an interesting observation in terms of which island has a higher re-election rates for incumbents. So if you guys have any insights on that, I would be happy to hear. And the question that I wanted to see is if these incumbents who are no longer in office, so for example, if they got out of office in June and hence have no access to, technically have no access to the state resources, for example, they can't use the district car or something to go around, they can't use the franking privileges because they're no longer the incumbent, are they less likely to be re-elected or not? And if you see the patterns, it's just really variable. There doesn't seem to be any trend. So again, the positive numbers are the number of months that they're out of office. So for example, like 6 is they're out of office in June. And we're looking at the percent of incumbents who are re-elected. And again, the negative numbers are the guys who are finishing in 2016. So they're always in office. And technically, you would expect that the guys who are always in office there's a higher chance of being re-elected because they can use all these state resources. But it seems really variable when you look at the data. It doesn't seem to, there's no pattern that's showing up. And this is a similar graph, but now we're looking at vote shares. And again, it does not seem to vary when their term ends and the corresponding vote shares that they are getting. So it suggests that perhaps maybe these short-term electoral advantages may not matter. So now I kind of disaggregated it a little bit and looked at the number of days that they're no longer in office, and I think this shows a little bit more clearly that the line is pretty flat. And in fact, if you see the guys who are finishing up in 2016, their vote share seems to be less than those who are out of office in 2015, as you see like an upward sloping line. Although that is also not significant, so it seems to show null results. And in conclusion, the data kind of shows that these short-term benefits derived from the perquisites of holding office does not seem to matter. I've highlighted 3 possible ideas of why this may be the case. The first is that perhaps that incumbents are just so entrenched, they have these patronage networks that they've kind of formed throughout their 5 years in office, that these short-term benefits of being in office during the elections time may not necessarily matter as much. The second is that perhaps these long-term benefits matter more. For example, the control over district budget, which is set a year in advance. So for the 2015 elections, it's in 2014, and hence they could use that to their advantage, and it would still be in place in 2015 when they're no longer in office. And finally, and perhaps more optimistically, perhaps voters are just not as ignorant as we think, and they're more perceptive and less susceptible to the tricks that incumbents have in their sleeves. So these are kind of the 3 different ideas that I have for why I'm getting these null results, and I think that's a possible exploration for future research. So with that, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Melissa. Okay, we'll take as many questions as there might be, but please, comments or questions, but please be brief and direct to the point. We'll see how much time we have for her to answer. Yes.
Were you able to do any analysis of the populations of these districts? If it's a more populous or a bigger district, is there a stronger incumbency advantage? If it's a less populous district, is there a stronger incumbency advantage? you would think that might also be highly variable.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's collect some questions if you don't mind.
Or yeah, let me
would it
just
be
quickly.
easier? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. Kathleen.
With the Java being Java and Bali having more preference towards incumbency, is there any possibility about the infrastructure of these advantages being more doable in Java rather than in outside of Java and Bali?
Elizabeth?
I was curious in your framing of the possible advantages of incumbency. I rarely come across someone more cynical than me, but I didn't see the done a good job. That actually they were a good ruler and therefore that might give them an advantage in terms of re-election, and I'm curious what you think about that, and I think it might have implications for your third possibility, which is that voters are not idiots, which I think there's a lot of evidence of that in Indonesia in all sorts of directions, but maybe, that people get thrown out because they haven't done a good job, and maybe that is something to explore in the Java Bali versus newer districts, outer islands dichotomy as well.
Okay, I think we can take just two more. Sorry. Okay, three. So please, very briefly, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to extend this question, because I'm doing a similar research, but I'm more interested in the budget. So how do you actually relate the incumbency advantage to the budget of the incumbent itself? So I think budget matters more compared to incumbency. Yeah. So.
Okay, Peter?
Yeah, is there any issue of ethnicity? Because obviously the returns show that Ahok has an 82% approval rate and a 51% re-election rate. So that indicates that there's quite a gap between the approval rate and the fact that he's an Indonesian Chinese, the willingness of people to re-elect him.
Okay. And Philip?
I think, like all of these people, in a sense, there are a lot of things in Sasanas or party political affiliation, other things that it would be interesting to see if they were related to your results. I wonder which of those you want to look at.
Okay.
Which of these are the variables? Because everybody, in a sense, has said, have you thought about relating it to this or that or the other? Ethnicity, population size, population composition, religion, party affiliation.
Right.
Which are the ones you want to go for?
And I'll exploit my position as chair. I'll add, do you see any dynasty building? Coming from the Philippines, I have to ask. Okay, so do you need me to summarize, or have you got, because it's quite a lot, but basically it's different factors. Have you
Okay,
thought
let
of
me
them?
try to answer that. And if I miss something, just kind of, raise your hands and let me know. So I guess this is a bit technical, but with the idea of the natural experiment, which exploits kind of this differences in election timing, that's not related to district characteristics and incumbent quality. The idea is that when you take a big enough sample, that these shouldn't matter, like they would average out, but it doesn't show like heterogeneous effects, right? It only shows overall what is the effect of holding office during an election time. So I guess with this method, it's technically like you're kind of controlling for these different ethnicity or population that might play a role in elections. So for this research, I'm actually like kind of looking across all of Indonesia rather than specific instances. But there's also the possibilities that these different factors like population or ethnicity might have different roles. So that's kind of the next step that I would be exploring to see if there's different heterogeneous effects. I guess that's what we would call it. And it's funny that you mentioned performance, Elizabeth, because that's kind of the next step to the research. Is I do want to see whether or not voters do care about performance and whether you see these different effects based on performance. I was thinking of doing that by looking at road quality, because we have really good data on road quality in the PODES. And seeing whether or not changes in road quality affect vote shares differently for different incumbents. And I'm not really sure if that's the best measure, but it's sort of the measure that I have at hand. So I guess that's kind of the first cut. But if you have any other suggestions on how to do that, I'd love to talk to you afterwards. And in terms of budget, I also just collected data from the Ministry of Finance on that. So another thing that I wanted to look at is the political budget cycles and whether or not, especially Dana Bansos and HIPAA, which is grants and social spending.
Social
Yeah,
funding.
whether, I mean, there's lots of accusations in the media of incumbent mayors kind of raising these discretionary spending during the election year. So that's kind of the next step in the research that I would be looking at and see if that plays a role and how that ties in also with performance. Dynasty building, that's really interesting, but I don't have data on that at the moment, so can't really answer that. Did I miss anything else?
It's okay.
Yeah?
I think you've covered everything.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so since we're short on time, I'm just going to move right along to introduce Kathleen Azali, who's a research associate at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. Before that, she worked in an independent library in Surabaya.
Still.
Oh, and still does, sorry. She's presenting findings from her mixed method study of urban youth political participation online, focusing on elections as well as the implementation of sustainable development goals.
Hi. All right. Okay, this is the title. I should have added in Java. I did my research in basically Jakarta, Surabaya, Jogja, and Bandung. Not too in depth because of the limited field days. But so what I'm curious basically is that youth, pemuda, used to have such prominence in Indonesian narrative. But now we see that it doesn't seem to figure as predominantly. In the past we have that pemuda, and during the Orde Baru, the pemuda revolutionary connotation was kind of scrapped out and removed with, replaced with remaja. Remaja now we see it a bit disappearing. But at the same time, there are also lots of criticism against pemuda, of course. I mean, sometimes it's say that it's too romanticizing. But many people also remark that it has very vibrant style, very iconographic, so very visual, very kind of performative, in that sense. But at the same time, many people also criticize that it lacks political organization power. The identity tends to be dispersed, and usually they kind of get diffused after the lack of the disappearance of the common enemy. So many people, like we see when Suharto disappeared, and people say, oh, tidak ada musuh bersama anymore. And then that gets us to the impasse of aging as moderating effect, or people remarking that, oh, these young radicals, they are now settling down as yuppies, or respectable citizens, or co-opted into power structure, into corrupt officials, or whatever. So these are the basically why I get interested in it. My feeling is that from that binary, now we are moving into kind of a blurred generasi anak muda, generasi / anak muda sometimes. So it's not pemuda, but anak muda or generasi muda. And we actually see that the state is encouraging this activism and citizenship. So we have the Act of Youth on Youth, you can look it up later. I'm not going to talk much about it. But the sentiment that we are seeing in Indonesia currently is that, yes, there's this blur between activism and consumption, or production and consumption. And if you look into this, this is just one post in someone's blog, but it's very prevalent among many youth, old or young youth in Indonesia. So it's saying that mahasiswa, students, you used to be very revolutionary, now you are just a networking organizers, so even organizers. But at the same time, you also see that all these creative markets, if you look into events Surabaya, this is kind of there's a proliferation of events, markets, or basically networking events, marketing that is growing in Indonesia. And this one, it's not just in Surabaya, you can find it in Jogja, Jakarta, blah, blah, blah. And this kind of combination of music, fun, films, and political campaigns, hey, you can see that prominently in 2014 elections. And it's been true for some time. So, back to that again, the prominence of representation, visual quality. We very frequently now we hear about Indonesia being having youthful, vibrant population, and the other famous one is emerging middle and consuming class, ripe for investment, also high prospect for private education. But at the same time, if you look more closely, the average population age, 45% are less than 1 million. So, and then annual minimum wage change annually, but at the same time, there's no enforcement whether they get annual minimum wage. Many people actually do not have that guarantee. 75% work in informal sector, again, no guarantee. 43.77% as labor employee, but very few of them will be in full-time position. And 19% unpaid labor. So 95% is in small, small enterprise. Many are actually unregistered. So my feeling is that we are, and many have also kind of feel that Indonesia seems to be similar to the West in the 60s, prolongation of youth, or maybe now even prolongation of youth as a transition period, as higher education, later marriage, postponed job entry. But the problem of skill mismatch and rapid urban agglomeration is getting even worse. And we are in a way entering the highly heterogeneous and precarious middle class. So trying to move beyond the binary and the impasse of the consumptive and revolutionary, the conveyance of values, the representation, style, visuality, charisma has long been a hallmark of Indonesian politics. And issues actually frequently take backseats. If we notice the political presidential debates last year, there's no much difference in their economic platforms, for example. But in terms of style, there's a lot of conversations as if there are big differences. But in terms of real issues, economic differences, there's not much. So trying to move, because social movements, of course, do not rely only selfless heroism, blah, blah. And of course, it's also happening all around the world, that movements everywhere, where usually they fizzle after the resistance stage. So maybe it's kind of good to move it beyond that. And the fact that identity-based secondary front politics have emerged after 60. So I'm interested into looking into how the prolongation of diffuse youth, because now the category of youth legally is up to 30 now, but many it's funny, but at the same time, when many people get excited, for example, for Ahok and Jokowi saying that, oh, pemimpin muda, it's so weird. Yang muda.
Young leader.
Yeah. It's not. 186 million voters, 32 million were first-time voters. 1/3 of them are under 25 years old. This gets many think tanks and many politicians khawatir, because oh my god, gawat kalau anak muda se-antipati if they are against politics. 34% of them are golongan muda, cannot be golput, tidak bertanggung jawab, you're not responsible. So they are very targeted. Clocks to vote, online or offline. So there are many political education, going to schools, going to civic organizations, persuading people to, and training people to vote even in primary schools. But at the same time, you don't see them in 2014. Not that pemuda category. It's not that prominent. Rather, you see them joining hands, diffuse again, in NGOs, civil society, musicians, filmmakers, farmers, peasants, laborers, so, and their parents, of course, and other groups. Oh, I think sorry, got me. And you notice also the emergence of relawan and komunitas and creative. So we don't know the number for sure, but we have more than 100 dispersed ad hoc komunitas relawan. The famous one is the Agora Bung Karno, organized mostly by almost all, we say. I can't get certain information, but they say that it's completely volunteers, no political parties involved. If you see the flags, none of them actually come from political parties. And also campaign creative is being emphasized as utilizing varieties of audiovisual media. So these are some of the things that, oh sorry, I think I got my presentation mixed up. But anyway, yeah, education and how they impact political participation has been discussed. But the issue, I think, one of the issues that not just the liberalization of education, but that we are producing more graduates than what can be absorbed. So, and there's also investment, a lot of investment in private education, but the joke is, of course, lecturers, very common, even among the graduates. Once you graduate, oh selamat jadi pengangguran kamu. So you're not cool anymore, you're not students anymore, you're pengangguran. Good luck in finding jobs. So this extends for months, sometimes for years, and there's the imbalance between supply and demand. So you have more educated but mismatched jobs. Youths are compelled to jostle within highly informal economic landscape without job security. So many students actually have to find jobs in the famous one, of course, is I'm trying to this case, September 2015. Project was very prospective. There are so many students registering. You can see that, but by this early this year, already went into ugly scene of people fighting. So yeah, that's just a case of education. I want to bring you to the creative economy though, because this creative and entrepreneurship term, which has been pushed particularly during the SPY period. So apa itu ekonomi kreatif lah, just going to go very quickly, but you can see the difference. So there's kind of like segregating between buruh and pekerja kreatif. And that it's economy industry, economy creative, it's very different. And that the target is, of course, the generasi muda Indonesia. So the creative economy subsectors have undergone through different subsectors categorizing. But if you notice, right, the latest one doesn't even have research and development. And you wonder why culinary actually gets into this creative economy. It seems like everything gets plunked into it, and this gets very this creative economy entrepreneurship gets very widely pushed into campuses. You see technopreneur campus, entrepreneurship campus, and everywhere. We have these categories, and whenever I ask policymakers, so what's the difference between creative economy culinary and food and beverage, standard food and beverage business? Nobody can give an answer. There are some instances when they are showing culinary and also hotels and restaurants right next to each other. So you wonder, what's the difference between statistics? And again, this is my suspicion. Food and beverage investment, big big possibilities. So it feels like it's being plunked into just to boost the numbers. And a famous case of creative city is Bandung. Bandung, and there's also I forgot now. There are 2 creative cities now admitted into UNESCO in Indonesia. Bandung is a famous one since 2007 actually, but there is. So we are seeing lots of packaging, lots of styling, but public facilities actually deteriorate. And recently, this one caused a lot of furor in international and local media because, criticism about Bandung being a creative city and causing a lot, despite the really bad public facilities, congestion and everything. I'm trying to bring you to Surabaya because there's not much about written about Surabaya creative city, whereas Bandung a lot. Surabaya hasn't been registered in the creative city, but again, the pattern of building incubators, co-working space, this is also happening in Surabaya and actually other cities as well. So the call for volunteers for working in media and asking design students to help the UMKM to package their products. But whether these products actually become products that are sellable, that's another question entirely. This was done actually for the Surabaya anniversary. Okay, and Risma encouraging the headmaster to behave more like CEO, and if you notice that this anxiety, property outlook, these are even organizer also, and also news. They work closely with the Surabaya government, again boosting property. I'm skipping that. Oh, sorry, I think I got mixed up. The recent controversial one is the crackdown of the red light district, Dolly. It has been turned into again the visualization that the drama performance that lots of drama, but it's turned into free training for technology, for creative, and turned into kampung wisata kreatif.
Kathleen, can I ask you to maybe wrap up in 1 or 2 minutes, like the main points that you want to?
All right. So branding of bus stops, but the bus actually never come. Anyway, so some of the lockdowns. So these are the summary of to wrap up. I feel that there are enforcing of arbitrary categorizing and economic indicator, but no social cultural indicators. And things that we rarely look into is the uncontrolled property market and speculative investment that is related to creative economy. And I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, sorry I had to
That's all right, sorry.
press you for time, but this gives us an opportunity to take comments or questions on this presentation. Yes, please.
It's interesting that you say the category of Pemuda has gone, and I think that's true. One of the things we do still have, though, is the category of student, right? We have a lot of student movements. And so I wonder if we can think not just of like anak muda or remaja, but if we can think of the category of student, especially of university student, mahasiswa, as being in some ways a replacement category, as the number of people who are going to university has grown widely. And that replaces what might have previously been the Pemuda movements.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just one very minor question about the disappearance of Pemuda. Don't you think it's also because of the notion of gender that is now quite appearing in Indonesia?
Yes.
I just have to think of the concert of Jokowi that you also showed, where he was in the Gelora. I remember I was there, and then Jokowi also said something like, let me be your older brother. And I wonder if this whole development is, like, in a way I see it's very neoliberal, but I think there's also another side as the state, which also represents itself not anymore as the Bapak Pembangunan atau Bapak Bangsa or whatever. But I just had to think of it that Jokowi himself was also, no, I'm your bigger brother, and now tell your adik-adik to vote me. If this is actually like something like a new identity where it's all going. But thank you a lot for the presentation. Thank you a lot.
Okay. The student. I don't know. I mean, in my interviews and my data, it doesn't seem like that the student themselves were prominent as identity. The more prominent ones are again musicians, filmmakers, kind of like dispersed. So it's not the student per se. What will be interesting is actually the religious student groups. Now they are definitely getting more prominent, but I haven't looked into them yet. The pemuda and the gender, there is that, and that's actually talked about a lot in the movement literature after the 60s. That particularly after you get more female participation, then that gets. But at the same time, the student participation or youth participation themselves, per se, as a whole, as youth identity. Again, they get diffused. They participate with the older ones, basically, not necessarily just youth. And the brother, that's actually an interesting way to think about how this the shift of the positioning between state and society.
Okay, well with that, let's thank Kathleen. Maybe there'll be more time later for further discussion at the end. Okay, now moving from Indonesia to the Philippines. So, for those of you who missed the introduction earlier, my name is Sol Iglesias. I'm a PhD candidate at the Southeast Asian Studies Department at the National University of Singapore. And while the running thread, especially among the first three presentations for this panel today, has really been about micropolitics and the local politics. And this is exactly what my research focuses on as well. So what we see here in this photograph, this image was taken on the 1st of April, but it was not a funny joke at all. This is Kidapawan in North Cotabato in southern Philippines. So there were hundreds of farmers and peasant activists, essentially, that were protesting because of a long drought and the effect on their yields. Basically, they were protesting, asking for relief from hunger. And this is one main narrative. The dust hasn't exactly settled yet. But essentially, what happened was after 1 or 2 days of a standoff, it's not entirely clear how the order was made and under what circumstances, and why the police and the military were present with firearms, but the crowd was fired upon. And 3 people have died, and over 100 people have been badly wounded. Okay? So the inquiries are still going on, but I thought I would comment on this very recent occurrence, because this is not the kind of image you would expect in a democracy, even if Philippine democracy is characterized as quite extremely flawed. But nevertheless, the crackdown on demonstration, political demonstration, and through violence exemplifies the complex question of state repression under democracy. So first of all, in this case, what we can glean from this is that it involves the use of force by state security forces, primarily the police, but the military was also present inexplicably. It has raised the specter of excessiveness and illegitimacy. Second, the respective roles of the provincial governor, who has been quite prominent in the news trying to explain why relief hadn't been provided to the farmers months ago, for example. The respective role as well relative to the central government, that has yet to be explained in this case. But the problems surrounding it have highlighted this sort of tension between central and local. And then finally, the incident occurred shortly before national and local elections take place next month. So obviously many parties and other interested factions have politicized the event for one purpose or another. And the incumbent government has alleged that left-wing activists had exploited the farmers, made the crowd swell, and even possibly precipitated the violence. So these kinds of themes, the role of the local government and the national government, security forces, and this question of insurgency, especially left-wing political parties and organizations, this plays out into the investigation that I'm doing on state repression. Okay, so not as statistically sophisticated as the earlier presentation, but I do have some national level statistics from secondary sources that give you an idea of trends in political violence or state violence in the past, over 40 years. Okay? So the timeline starts in 1972, the year that former President Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law. And by the time he was deposed in 1986, Marcos had been in power for 20 years. What you can see here are 4 different kinds of political violence. And what is clear, so the first bar under each presidency corresponds to counterinsurgency battle deaths. Under Marcos, for instance, I mean, these are annual figures, annualized figures, and under Marcos it was 10 times as much as what you can find in many of the subsequent presidencies. And the same goes for extrajudicial killings, where you had something like an average of 200 killings a year. The number falls drastically over successive presidencies until the presidency of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, 2001 to 2010. And I'll speak about that, I'll explain this in further detail later. Now the other set of data, a second set of data, or rather, in comparison to what can be considered strategic forms of state violence, counterinsurgency, and to some extent extrajudicial killings against, let's say, opponents of the state. And in these cases, security forces like the military and the police and military intelligence have been implicated. Other forms of political violence, which can be considered more particularistic in nature, have oddly been on the rise. Not in significant numbers, but still, we find that electoral violence increases somewhat, except perhaps in the final, the current administration, but we'll see what happens next month. But electoral violence has actually increased in the democratic period after the end of authoritarian rule. And then here, killings of journalists, and this is on a different scale because the absolute numbers are not even double digits. But they increase. They increase in the post-authoritarian period. And even if these numbers in absolute terms are small, in relative terms, we have to remember that the Philippines is now one of the worst places in the world for journalists to work. So this is significant. So that those kinds of trends basically were puzzles that I wanted to explain through research. Now, I am in the phase of my research, my doctoral research, where I've just basically come back with a haul of a lot of data from the Philippines. And I've just done my preliminary analysis, which I will be presenting today. So in terms of the data, what I have is about 1,600 individual case files. These are files that have been lodged as complaints with the Commission on Human Rights, primarily over the course of the last 15 years, so from 2001 onwards. And a number of files come from the joint monitoring committee of the peace panel between the Philippine government and the Communist Party of the Philippines, including the New People's Army and the National Democratic Front. Basically the armed left. Okay, so the peace process has a provision for monitoring complaints of human rights violations, as well as violations of international humanitarian law. And I've supplemented the data with selected files from human rights NGOs. I've also begun to do a media scanning to help explain the circumstances surrounding each case. Now, very briefly, the only reason why I didn't have as many cases, ironically, from the NGOs is simply because they were more protective over the identities of the people that they work with. For some reason, the government was not as protective. Okay, so this map shows you also another puzzle, or another piece of the puzzle. What basically this shows you is that counter to expectation, state violence actually occurs in places where the state is weakest, where they essentially do not have monopoly over the use of force. So in this map, the land areas are shaded from light gray to dark gray to black. So the darker it is, that means you have the presence of a higher number of private armies, usually under the command of local politicians. And then the borders, which correspond mainly to regions, are where through the secondary data that I showed you earlier, but looked at in a different way, we have increasing levels of forms of state violence, including counterinsurgency kills and extrajudicial killings. So green meaning green is low, and then yellow is moderate, and red is high. So for this presentation, I focus on 4 areas for the moment. This is Ilocos Norte, where the Marcoses are from, Cagayan Valley, and the Cordilleras. So this is one of the areas where the number of killings have been low to moderate. And then Central Luzon, where the number of killings have been high. Western Visayas, again, where the number of killings have been moderate. And Eastern Visayas, where the number of killings have been high.